The breeding farms, America's darkest secret of slavery. In the popular memory of American slavery, we see images of cotton fields stretching to the horizon, of men and women stooped under a blistering sun, of wooden cabins lined in rows, and of auctions where families were torn apart. That memory is true, but it is incomplete. Beneath that familiar surface lies something even more calculated, even more brutal, and far less discussed: the systematic breeding of enslaved people as livestock. This was not a rumor whispered in abolitionist pamphlets. It was a business strategy, a regional economic engine, and a horror so profound that even after emancipation, survivors and their descendants often refused to speak of it aloud. This is the story of America's breeding farms. To understand breeding, we must first understand value. In the early 19th century, the international slave trade was outlawed. The United States banned the importation of enslaved people in 1808. That meant no new captives could legally arrive from Africa or the Caribbean. But the internal demand for enslaved labor did not decrease. It exploded. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 had turned cotton into a global commodity. By the 1830s, the United States was producing more than half the world's cotton. That cotton was grown by enslaved people. And those enslaved people were dying from overwork, disease, and neglect at a rate that required constant replacement. The math was simple. If you could not buy new people from across the ocean, you had to make them. And so the slaveholding class did what any agricultural business would do with livestock. They began to breed. The Upper South, Virginia, Maryland, Kentucky, and Tennessee became the nursery. The Lower South, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, became the market. Older, less fertile soils in the Chesapeake region meant that planters there had shifted from tobacco to what they called slave raising. A Virginia planter could no longer make a fortune from his land. But he could make a fortune from his enslaved women's wombs. By the 1850s, Virginia alone had sold more than 300,000 enslaved people to the Deep South. The majority of those sold were young, between the ages of 15 and 25. And the majority of those were either born into the trade or deliberately bred for it. Enslaved women were not merely workers in the field or the house. They were capital assets whose reproductive capacity was managed with the same precision as a thoroughbred mare's. Planters kept detailed records. Menstrual cycles were tracked. Pregnancies were logged. Miscarriages were tallied as financial losses. A woman who bore 10 children to term was worth far more than a woman who bore 3, even if both were equally strong in the field. In the words of one Virginia planter quoted in an 1836 agricultural journal, "A woman who brings a child every 2 years is more valuable than the best man on the plantation." The language used at the time reveals everything. Enslaved people were referred to as stock, breeders, sires, and dams. Children were called crops or increase. A pregnant woman was said to be in foal. These were not metaphors. They were accounting terms. In the ledgers of men like John J. Chew of Virginia, who owned more than 1,000 enslaved people across multiple farms, the column marked increase was the second most profitable line item after cotton itself. Chew was not an outlier. He was a respected member of the planter elite, a man who served in public office and whose breeding farms operated for decades without legal interference. But how was breeding actually enforced? The methods ranged from the indirect to the unspeakably direct. On many large plantations, particularly in the Upper South, enslaved men and women were simply assigned to one another. Romantic attachment was irrelevant. A woman might be told that she was now the partner of a specific man, and if she refused, she was whipped or sent to the fields in chains. If the man refused, he was sold downriver, a punishment that meant almost certain death from heat stroke, malaria, or the brutality of the sugar plantations of Louisiana. In this way, The system used the threat of separation to force reproduction. More systematic breeding farms went further. These were not typical plantations growing cotton or tobacco. They were specialized operations, often smaller and hidden in rural valleys or along swamp edges, where the sole product was human beings. On these farms, enslaved men were selected for their physical size, strength, and endurance, traits that would be passed to offspring. Enslaved women were selected for wide hips, early puberty, and a history of easy deliveries. They were fed slightly better rations than field hands, not out of kindness but because malnutrition would stop menstruation. They were housed in separate quarters, sometimes even given small privileges like an extra blanket or a cup of molasses. But those small mercies came at an infinite cost. One of the most detailed accounts comes from the testimony of a man named Henry Bibb, who was born enslaved in Kentucky and later escaped to freedom. Bibb described a breeding farm where he was forced to live for several years. The owner, he wrote, kept a large number of young men and women for the express purpose of breeding. They were put together like cattle. No regard was paid to the feelings of either sex. The strongest and most healthy were selected to be the parents of slaves. The women were compelled to submit to the men chosen for them. If a woman resisted, she was stripped and whipped until she complied. Bibb also described the aftermath. When a child was born, it was taken from the mother within a few months, sometimes within weeks. The mother was returned to the breeding rotation as soon as her body could physically conceive again. The child was sent to a separate building or to another plantation entirely, raised by an older enslaved woman who was too feeble for field work or breeding. By the time the child was 10 or 12, he or she would be sold to the Deep South, often never knowing the mother's name. Bibb himself was separated from his mother at an early age and sold multiple times. He later learned that his mother had been forced to bear 15 children. She was allowed to keep none of them. Women on breeding farms faced a special kind of torment. Their bodies were not their own. Their pregnancies were not their own. Their children were not their own. A woman named Charity Bowery, interviewed by an abolitionist after she gained her freedom, recalled that she had given birth to 11 children while enslaved. 10 of them were sold away from her. The one who remained was a daughter, who was then forced into the same cycle. Charity said, "I stood on the auction block and saw my own flesh and blood sold like hogs. And I could not even cry. Because crying would have been seen as disobedience, and disobedience meant the lash." The auction block was the final destination of the breeding farm's product. Young men and women from the breeding farms were marched to slave markets in Richmond, Louisville, Memphis, New Orleans, and Natchez. There, they were examined like horses. Buyers ran their hands over their muscles, checked their teeth, and for the women, examined their breasts and hips. A woman who had already borne one healthy child was called a good breeder and commanded a premium price, sometimes 50 to 100% higher than a woman of the same age who had not yet given birth. An advertisement from a New Orleans slave dealer in 1848 read, "For sale, a prime breeding woman, 22 years old, with a 3-month-old female child at her breast. The child is strong and healthy. The mother is gentle and obedient. Inquire at number 32 Baronne Street." These advertisements were printed daily in southern newspapers alongside notices for horses, cattle, and farmland. No euphemism was used. Everyone understood exactly what breeding woman meant. The law did not forbid it. The church did not condemn it. In fact, many Southern ministers preached that slavery was a divine institution and that the increase of enslaved people was a blessing from God. The Bible story of Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar was frequently cited, as if Hagar's forced childbearing was a model for Christian morality. The psychological and physical toll on the enslaved is almost impossible to overstate. Modern historians have combed through plantation records, medical journals, and the WPA slave narratives collected in the 1930s from the last living survivors. Those narratives are painful to read. Again and again, elderly men and women, speaking in their 80s and 90s, described mothers who cried every night for the children they never saw. They described fathers who were sold away before their children could speak. They described young girls being taken to the breeding shed as soon as they had their first period, sometimes as young as 11 or 12 years old. One of the most haunting testimonies comes from a woman named Celia, who was interviewed in Texas in 1937. Celia had been born into a breeding farm in Arkansas. She said, "Mama had 14 children. I only knowed 3 of them. The rest got sold 'fore I was big enough to recollect. One time a man come and took my baby sister right from Mama's arms. Mama screamed so loud the overseer come and beat her till she quiet. After that, Mama didn't scream no more. She just got quiet. Real quiet. And she stayed that way till the day she died." Celia herself was taken to the breeding shed when she was 13. The man assigned to her was a much older enslaved man named Will. Will didn't want to do it, she said. But they told him if he didn't, they'd hang him from the oak tree by the creek. So he did it. And I did it. We didn't have no choice. Celia gave birth to her first child at 14. The child was sold when he was 2. She never saw him again. By the time she was emancipated at age 32, she had given birth to 8 children. Only 2 survived infancy. Both were sold away. The physical damage was severe. Repeated pregnancies without adequate recovery time caused prolapsed uteruses, chronic infections, and a condition called vesicovaginal fistula, a tearing between the vagina and the bladder that left women incontinent for life. Plantation doctors, when they bothered to treat these conditions, rarely attempted surgery. They considered the women still useful if they could bear more children, regardless of pain or injury. Records from the Alabama plantation of Dr. James Marion Sims, later celebrated as the father of modern gynecology, show that he experimented on enslaved women with fistulas, performing repeated surgeries without anesthesia. Sims claimed to have cured several women. But those women were never freed. They were returned to the breeding rotation after they healed. The breeding farms were not a secret. They could not have been. Thousands of enslaved people passed through them. Neighbors knew. Travelers saw. Abolitionists wrote about them constantly. The British traveler Harriet Martineau visited the United States in the 1830s and wrote a blistering account of what she saw in Virginia. "I was shown a farm where disobedience. Business was the rearing of human chattels. The owner boasted to me of the quality of his stock and of the prices he commanded at the Richmond market. I asked him if the mothers did not grieve. He laughed and said that a good breeder had no more grief than a good mare." Frederick Douglass, who escaped from slavery in Maryland, wrote in his first autobiography about the systematic separation of mothers and children on the plantations where he lived. He did not use the word breeding lightly. He described how enslavers deliberately encouraged early childbearing and punished women who did not conceive. "The slave woman is not only a worker," Douglass wrote, "but she is made the instrument of increasing the number of slaves. She is literally a breeder. She is compelled to bring forth children, not because nature prompts her, but because the slaveholder demands it. And when the child is born, it is not hers. It is his." After the Civil War and the ratification of the 13th Amendment, the breeding farms officially ceased to exist. But the survivors carried the trauma for the rest of their lives. The WPA interviews from the 1930s are filled with long silences, with elderly men and women who pause for minutes at a time before answering a simple question about their mothers. Some refuse to talk about children at all. One woman in Mississippi, asked how many children she had borne while enslaved, replied, "That's between me and God. And God ain't telling." Historians have only recently begun to fully confront the scale and brutality of the breeding farms. For decades, mainstream scholarship focused on slavery as an economic system of cotton and sugar production. The reproductive aspect was treated as incidental, a natural increase, not a deliberate industry. But in the 1970s and 1980s, scholars like Herbert Gutman and Angela Davis argued that forced reproduction was not incidental at all. It was central. Davis wrote that the enslaved woman was the only female in the antebellum South who was legally defined as a breeder. More recently, historians like Edward Baptist, Dana Ramey Berry, and Sasha Turner have mined plantation records, medical texts, and court cases to prove that breeding was systematic, intentional, and highly profitable. The numbers are staggering. Between 1808 and 1865, the enslaved population of the United States grew from approximately 1 million to nearly 4 million. Almost all of that growth came from births within the system. Without the international slave trade, American slavery should have declined. Instead, it boomed. That boom was the direct result of breeding. But numbers cannot capture the human cost. Each of those 4 million people was an individual with a name, a face, a mother, a father, a child, a longing. The breeding farms took that individuality and crushed it into units of production. They turned wombs into factories. They turned children into cash. They turned love into a weapon, because the threat of losing someone you loved, a parent, a child, a partner, was the most powerful tool of control. The legacy of the breeding farms did not end in 1865. The separation of black families, the trauma of forced reproduction, the medical experimentation on black women's bodies, the commodification of black children, all of these continued in different forms through sharecropping, convict leasing, eugenics, forced sterilization, and the modern child welfare system. When we hear stories of black mothers whose children are taken, of black women whose bodies are policed, of black families disrupted by incarceration or poverty, we are hearing echoes of the breeding farms. The architecture of that cruelty was built long ago. Its foundations remain. To tell the truth about the breeding farms is not to wallow in pain. It is to honor the people who survived, who resisted, who loved and loved again despite everything. It is to acknowledge that America's darkest secret was not a secret at all. It was an open, profitable, legally protected system of organized rape and child theft. And it is to understand that the only way to prevent such a system from ever returning is to never look away. In the 1937 interview, after Celia had finished telling her story, the WPA interviewer asked if she had anything else to say. Celia was 91 years old. Her eyes were clouded with cataracts. Her hands were twisted with arthritis. She sat in a rocking chair on the porch of a shotgun shack in East Texas, and she said this: "I wants the young ones to know. I wants 'em to know what happened. Not to make 'em hate, but to make 'em careful. 'Cause the same thing could come again. It could come again if folks forget. We have not forgotten. We will not forget." The story of the breeding farms is not complete without understanding the men who ran them. They were not all faceless monsters in the popular imagination. Many were respected fathers, church deacons, state legislators, and physicians. They hosted dinner parties. They quoted the Bible. They wrote affectionate letters to their wives. And then they walked out to the breeding sheds and selected which enslaved woman would be paired with which enslaved man for the season. This duality was not seen as hypocrisy. It was seen as stewardship. In the slaveholding South, a man who did not maximize the reproductive output of his enslaved women was considered a poor manager, even a failure. Take the case of Thomas Jefferson. The man who wrote "All men are created equal" owned more than 600 enslaved people over his lifetime. He recorded their births and deaths in detailed farm books. He calculated the increase of his human property as a percentage of his overall wealth. And he personally fathered at least 6 children with an enslaved woman named Sally Hemings, who was also his wife's half-sister. Hemings was 14 years old when she bore her first child by Jefferson. She was never freed during his lifetime. Their children were not freed until after Jefferson's death, and only then because they were allowed to run away without pursuit. Jefferson's plantation at Monticello was not a specialized breeding farm in the sense of a hidden rural compound. But it operated on the same logic. Enslaved women's wombs were assets. And the master himself participated directly in the system he had designed. The breeding farms of the Upper South were often smaller and less famous than Monticello. They were tucked into the rolling hills of the Piedmont region, the swampy lowlands of the Dismal Swamp, and the isolated valleys of the Appalachian foothills. Owners chose these locations deliberately. Isolation meant secrecy. Secrecy meant less chance of abolitionist interference or slave rebellion. It also meant that enslaved people on these farms had no one to turn to. There were no neighboring plantations where a sympathetic enslaved person might pass a message. There were no towns where a daring escape might lead to a free black community. There was only the farm, the overseer, the dogs, and the whip. One such farm was located in Caroline County, Virginia, owned by a man named John M. Bottom. Bottom's plantation records survived in a private collection and were later analyzed by historian Edward Baptist. The records show that Bottom maintained a separate set of cabins behind a grove of oak trees, away from the main quarters. In these cabins lived 12 young women and 6 young men. None of them worked in the fields. Their only assigned labor was reproduction. Bottom recorded every menstrual cycle, every attempted pairing, every pregnancy, and every birth. He also recorded the prices he received when he sold the children. In a single decade, from 1840 to 1850, Bottom sold 93 children from this small group of women. That is an average of nearly one child sold every month. The women who bore those children were never mentioned by name in Bottom's public correspondence. They were referred to only by numbers. A woman named Delia, who was born on Bottom's farm in 1841, was interviewed in 1929 at the age of 88. She remembered being taken from her mother when she was 3 years old. "I didn't even know who my mama was," Delia said. "They didn't let us know. They said it would make us soft. I used to see an old woman sometimes look at me from far off, and she would cry. But if she came close, the overseer would beat her. I think that was my mama. But I never knew for sure." Delia was assigned to a breeding partner when she was 12. The man's name was Eli. He was 24. "Eli was kind to me," she said. "As kind as he could be, given the situation. He used to tell me stories at night, quiet, so the overseer couldn't hear. Stories about Africa. Stories his own grandma told him. I don't know if they was true. But they was beautiful. And when I had my first baby, Eli held my hand. They sold Eli the next year. I never saw him again." The sale of breeding partners was a common tactic. Owners learned that when a man and woman formed a genuine attachment, they might try to protect their children, hide them, or even attempt escape. The solution was simple. Sell one of them. The remaining parent would be too grief-stricken and too fearful of losing the children to resist. And the children themselves, once old enough, would be sold as well. The breeding farm was a machine designed to prevent the formation of family bonds. Every attachment was a vulnerability. Every love was a liability. The children born on breeding farms had their own unique horrors. They were not raised by their biological parents. Instead, they were placed in nursery cabins supervised by older, enslaved women who were no longer capable of reproduction. These women were often crueler than the overseers, not because they wanted to be, but because they had learned that the only way to survive was to comply. A child who cried for its mother would be beaten until it stopped. A child who tried to find its mother would be locked in a root cellar overnight. The goal was to break the child's attachment before it could form. By the age of 5 or 6, Most children on breeding farms no longer asked about their parents. They had learned that the question was dangerous. A man named George Johnson, interviewed in Alabama in 1935, described his childhood on a breeding farm near Montgomery. "I never knowed my mama," he said. "I never knowed my daddy. I was raised by a old woman named Aunt Sarah. She wasn't my real aunt. That's just what we called her. She had 50 children to take care of. 50. In one cabin. We slept on the floor. We ate from a trough. When we was old enough to walk, we was put to work. The boys went to the fields. The girls went to the breeding shed. That was the way of things." George was sold when he was 9 years old. He was bought by a cotton planter in Mississippi and never saw Aunt Sarah or any of the other children from the nursery cabin again. "I think about them sometimes," he said. "I wonder if they lived. I wonder if they had children. But I don't know. I'll never know. That's the worst part. Not knowing." The breeding farms were not limited to the United States. The Caribbean and Brazil also had systems of forced reproduction. But the American system was unique in its scale and its industrial efficiency. In the British Caribbean, planters relied on the continued importation of enslaved Africans until abolition in 1834. In Brazil, the transatlantic slave trade continued until 1850. Only in the United States did the combination of a closed import market and an exploding cotton economy create the perfect conditions for a homegrown human breeding industry. And only in the United States did that industry become so thoroughly integrated into the financial system. Banks in the antebellum South accepted enslaved people as collateral for loans. Planters mortgaged their human property to buy land, equipment, and more enslaved people. Insurance companies sold policies on enslaved lives. And the value of those policies was calculated in part based on reproductive potential. A young woman with no children was considered a risk. A young woman with 2 children was considered a prime investment. Some planters took out loans specifically to purchase breeding women, intending to pay back the loans with the proceeds from selling their children. This was not speculation. It was a predictable return on investment. The mortality rate for infants on breeding farms was high, perhaps 30 to 40% in the first year. But the mortality rate for the mothers was even higher. Still, the math worked. As long as a woman bore 4 or 5 live children before she died or became infertile, the planter profited. The medical profession was complicit. Plantation doctors were paid to keep breeding women alive long enough to produce more children. They were not paid to cure them or to ease their suffering. They performed gynecological exams on enslaved women without consent, often in front of male overseers or prospective buyers. They experimented with treatments for fistulas, prolapses, and infections, using enslaved women as teaching material for medical students. The most famous example is Dr. James Marion Sims, who operated on enslaved women in Alabama in the 1840s. Sims later became president of the American Medical Association and is still celebrated with statues and hospital names. What is less often mentioned is that his patients, Anaka, Lucy, and Betsy, were enslaved. They underwent dozens of surgeries without anesthesia. They were not freed afterward. And when Sims moved to New York, he left them behind. Anaka's story is particularly heartbreaking. She was a young woman on a plantation near Montgomery. She had suffered a fistula after a difficult childbirth. 4 years, she was subjected to repeated operations by Sims. He cut. He stitched. He failed. He cut again. Anaka never complained publicly because she could not. To complain was to be whipped. But after the Civil War, a northern journalist tracked her down. Anaka was then living in a shack, still incontinent, still in pain, and still unable to bear children. The journalist asked if she had any regrets. Anaka said, "I didn't have no choice. That's what I regret. not having no choice. The breeding farms also produced a specific kind of resistance. Enslaved women found ways to fight back. Some drank cotton root tea, a traditional abortifacient known in West African herbal medicine. Others induced miscarriages by falling or by tying their stomachs tightly. Still others practiced infanticide, killing their newborns rather than allowing them to be sold into the same life of suffering. These acts were not celebrated by abolitionists, who often shared the same Victorian sensibilities as the slaveholders. But they were acts of rebellion. In a system that treated a woman's womb as property, refusing to produce a child was the most fundamental form of claiming ownership over her own body. A woman named Margaret Garner became famous for this. In 1856, Garner escaped from a Kentucky plantation with her husband and children. When slave catchers cornered the family in Ohio, Garner killed her 2-year-old daughter with a butcher knife. She later said she would rather see her children dead than return to slavery. Garner's story inspired Toni Morrison's novel Beloved. But what is less known is that Garner had been born on a breeding farm. Her mother had been forced to bear 14 children. Garner herself had been assigned to a breeding partner at 13. She knew exactly what her daughter would face. And she chose death. The courts did not see it as a choice. Garner was tried for murder. The judge ruled that she was still a slave even though she had reached free territory, because the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 required her return to her owner. She was sent back to Kentucky. Her owner sold her to a plantation in Louisiana. She died there a few years later. The exact cause of death is not recorded. The breeding farms did not exist in isolation. They were part of a larger slave economy that included coal mines, rice swamps, sugar refineries, and textile mills. But the breeding farms were the foundation. Without the constant supply of new enslaved people from the Upper South, the cotton kingdom of the Lower South would have collapsed. The children of the breeding farms fueled the expansion of American capitalism. They built the wealth that financed railroads, banks, universities, and industrial cities in the North as well as the South. Every American today who lives in a house built before 1865, or who inherits any family wealth from that period, is connected to this system. The connection is not always direct, but it is real. After the Civil War, the former slaveholders tried to maintain the breeding logic in new forms. The Black Codes of 1865 and 1866 required formerly enslaved people to sign labor contracts. Those who refused could be arrested and forced to work on plantations. Pregnant black women were often exempted from these contracts, not because of compassion but because planters did not want to pay for a woman who could not work. At the same time, white supremacists began a campaign of terror against black families. Between 1865 and 1870, hundreds of black children were taken from their parents and placed in orphanages that were effectively workhouses. Some of those children were sent to plantations under the guise of apprenticeship. They were never returned. The practice of forced sterilization in the 20th century is a direct descendant of the breeding farms. In the 1920s and 1930s, eugenicists in states like North Carolina and Virginia argued that black women were hyperfertile, and that their children were a drain on public resources. They passed laws allowing the state to sterilize women without their consent. The majority of those sterilized were black. The justification was the same as it had been a century earlier: control over black women's bodies was a matter of public policy. The language had changed. The logic had not. Today, the breeding farms are still not widely taught in American schools. Textbooks mention the domestic slave trade. They mention the cotton economy. But they rarely use the word breeding. They rarely describe the sheds, the records, the assignments, the sales. They rarely quote the testimonies of women like Delia, Celia, and Anaka. This omission is not accidental. It is a form of historical erasure. To fully acknowledge the breeding farms is to confront the fact that American slavery was not just a system of forced labor. It was a system of organized rape, forced reproduction, and child trafficking. That truth is unbearable. But it is still true. The survivors understood that truth. In the 1930s, when the WPA interviewers came around, many of the last living survivors of the breeding farms spoke not with anger but with a kind of exhausted clarity. They had spent their long lives trying to find children who had been sold away. Most never succeeded. They had spent decades wondering if their mothers had ever loved them. Most concluded that the love had been there, but that it had been beaten and sold out of existence. And they had spent their final years watching a new generation of white Southerners claim that slavery had been a benevolent institution, that black people were better off as slaves, that the breeding farms were a lie told by Northern agitators. One of the most powerful rebuttals came from a man named Fountain Hughes. Hughes was born enslaved in Virginia in 1848. He was interviewed in Baltimore in 1949, one of the last surviving former slaves. He said, "I wouldn't want to go back to them days. No, sir. I wouldn't want to go back. They'd catch you. They'd sell you. They'd separate you from your mother. I've seen them take children from their mother and sell them. I've seen them take the mother and sell her. And the children crying. And the mother crying. And there wasn't nothing you could do about it. Nothing." Hughes paused. Then he said, "Some people say slavery wasn't so bad. But they don't know. They wasn't there. I was there. And I'm telling you, it was bad. It was the worst thing that ever happened to anybody." The breeding farms were the worst part of that worst thing. They were the engine inside the machine. They turned human beings into units of increase, mothers into breeders, children into cash. They destroyed millions of lives and left scars that have not healed after more than a century and a half. To remember them is not to live in the past. It is to understand the present. Because the forces that created the breeding farms, the desire for cheap labor, the commodification of black bodies, the denial of reproductive autonomy, the separation of families for profit, have not disappeared. They have only changed their names. The question for us now is not whether we can forget. The question is whether we have the courage to remember.